Okay, so the tactics are basically the end of the game, and they're little 3 to 8 move combinations where the side with the advantage breaks through the enemy defenses to win the game. This first example is on the screen, and tonight's topic is attacking the king-knight pawn, the enemy's king-knight pawn. Most of the examples of the pawn will be on the king-knight 2 square, or if it's black, the g7 square. Later on, there's a few examples where the pawn's on king-knight 3 or g6 square. This is our first example, and it's white to play and win. So you can see that the white knight that's sitting on the f5 square is conveniently attacking our target pawn on g7, the black pawn on g7. Also, we have a nicely placed white bishop on the g5 square attacking the f6 knight. And the queen is hovering on e2, ready to pounce up that white diagonal toward the black king side. And then to top it off, we have a nicely placed white bishop on the b3 square attacking the black defender on e6. So those are all the elements that we need to have a successful attack for white. The question is, what is the proper sequence to move? And I'll leave it up to the audience to suggest a winning move for white. That's right. He has nothing better than pawn takes, and now what? On e6, and there's no stop to the queen to g4 check, followed by mate, but there's a way to avoid mate. How would black avoid checkmate? Oh yeah, but we can take the bishop and avoid mate. We take it with the pawn, then the queen comes up, and if the king moves up or over to the corner, queen to g7's mate, but we can block it with the black queen. And then we have knight to e7 check, and we pick the queen up and win that way. Okay, let's go to our next example. Obviously, white is the one attacking black's king, knight 7 again. Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. Who would like to suggest the winning move for white this time?
Bishop takes f6 again.
Bishop takes f6 could well win. I'm going to say that if you did that, black could reply queen takes knight on f5, threatening queen takes bishop. So there's a better way to win than bishop takes f6. Any other suggestions?
Knight to e7.
Well, that doesn't work because the queen can go back and just take the knight. Knight takes h6, that's the right idea. Very forceful. Pawn takes, now we take the knight on f6 with the bishop, and it conveniently protects our rook. And we threaten something like rook to g4 check, picking up the queen. So he moves the queen. Now he's threatening our bishop. What's the winning move here for, well, white's already winning because we have an attack where white's a pawn up, all the pieces are, well, our white squared bishop isn't developed, but it'll be developed soon. Black's knight's still on its first square, so that hasn't moved. Queen to g4 doesn't work because of queen takes queen, rook takes queen, bishop takes queen. So who would have another suggestion? this may seem very simplistic. I think it's queen to e5, just you trade queens and you have a winning attack, but let's see if there's something else.
Pawn to g4.
Well, then he has queen takes bishop. Don't forget he's threatening queen takes bishop on f6. So let's see what the, oh, it's not queen to e5. Better is queen to f3. Why is queen to f3 better than queen to e5? Both moves allow the trade of white's queen and would seem to weaken white's attack. Why is queen to f3 the stronger move? Well, the answer is, what happens after queen takes queen? Pawn takes queen, opening up the king-knight file, and then there's a nasty check on g1 check. Whereas if we had played queen to e5, he could trade queens and move his knight to d7 where it's protected by the bishop and attack the bishop on e5, forcing the bishop to retreat, and there's no open knight file with a killer check on g1. So that's the answer. So here he brings his knight up. Now we get a little pretty. We just take it. Bishop takes. Queen here, check. He can block it either way. The answer is almost the same. So queen to g4 is a little better. What's the winning move here for white? We're actually down the exchange, so we have to have a winning attack at this point. Who has a suggested move for white? Well, f3 is okay, but how about, can we bring another piece to the attack? Can we bring our bishop on f1 that's not doing anything and attack black's position?
Yeah,
e2, a queen can't take it, the queen's pinned, and if queen takes queen, it opens up our rook file, and we have rook takes pawn on h6, and there's no stopping rook to h8 checkmate. So he retreats the queen. Now what's the winning move?
queen to
It's the same bishop, but it moves to another square.
Bishop to h5.
Bishop to h5 is probably okay, but why not go to d3 where you attack the queen and you also cover the h7 square? That's better than h5. On h5, you don't cover the h7 square. So here it is. Now if he goes back to g4, now we play f3. And he has to do queen takes queen because he can't retreat. We open up, and then we got rook takes pawn and rook to h8 checkmate. So that's it. That's pretty much it. Okay. Okay. So, again, it's white is attacking black's g7 square, and we have a bishop on c3 attacking the g7 square, protected by our queen. Now, black has a knight on e4. He can take our bishop. It doesn't do him a lot of good because we just take with the queen, and then our queen attacks g7. We have a rook on g1. It's pointed toward g7. There's only one slight drawback. What would that drawback be? Vis-a-vis our rook on g1, as it pertains to attacking the g7 pawn. g4 is the move. The drawback is the pawn is in the way of the rook, so we got to get rid of the pawn. The best move is g4. This is the case. I'm going through examples, The Art of Chess Combinations by Eugene Snasko-Borovsky, a Russian. This book was written in 1936 before computers came out, and he actually proposes not the strongest move. His move is bishop takes pawn. We'll do that first, then we'll go back to the strongest. King takes, and then g4. Then the king moves over. Pawn takes, knight comes up, check. King back, rook takes pawn. We're on the queen and the knight. And our rook can go to g7 and then threaten rook takes knight checkmate. So that's pretty much it. But let's go back now and see what white should have done. Bishop to g7 is a good move in that it leads to a white advantage, but you see the plus over equal sign on the notation there? That's a slight advantage for white. If white had played your move, g4, he would have had a winning advantage. So this is the correct move, and the computer pointed it out. So the plus minus symbol is a winning advantage for white. The plus is on the left, so they do the white. It's a plus for white, a minus for black. That's a winning advantage for white. See, we're better off not sacrificing the bishop because we open up the G file, and then we have our bishop, and the threat is rook takes pawn check. That's the strongest way to attack. Black's best is to eliminate the bishop. Then the queen comes up. Now he doesn't have a way to block it, and if he does rook to f7, we can attack the rook with knight to g5, threatening knight takes rook. Anyway, black can try rook to c8. Now you would think g-pawn takes on f5 is the best move. But the computer says not so fast. I bet most players wouldn't see this move. White should bring up his pawn to h4. He has plenty of time to open up the G file. That pawn is going to advance to h6. If it's not stopped, then pawn takes pawn will be a winning combination. Black really, because black, you see, black is blocked his pawns. His D pawn is on the on his second row, or the D7 square. It blocks the queen and rook, so there's nothing black can't get his pieces where they can attack white, and he can't get his pieces over to defend the king side either. He brings his queen up. We advance the rook pawn again. Now black tries d5. That opens up the second row for the queen. It comes across. The knight does block the queen, but the queen is at least aiming toward g7. We just do pawn takes. Black does knight takes, attacking our queen. He drives the queen off the g7 square. Queen goes up to g4. Now the knight can't really move because the white queen would take the e6 pawn with check. Black does pawn takes g4. Rook takes pawn check is it's not check. Rook takes pawn is very strong, attacking the g7 square, but there's an even better move. The knight comes up to g5. Notice it's attacking that weak pawn on e6, which is undefended. Knight takes e6, threatens the knight fork on the queen and rook, winning the exchange in a pawn. Black brings the queen up. It defends the e6 pawn. But notice that the white queen and rook are on the d5 knight. The only thing protecting the d5 knight is the e6 pawn. So we take the e6 pawn. Queen takes, but now we get the knight back. Queen takes. Rook takes. And we've got a winning rook and pawn ending. White has 2, 4, 6 pawns. Black right now has 2, 4, 5 pawns. But black has 2 pawns being attacked at the same time. The pawn on g4. The pawn on g4. Black does defend the pawn on c5, but he can't protect the pawn on g4 white will be 2 pawns up, and black has no counterattacks because his rooks are poorly placed, and this is an easy one ending. So that's how the game should have gone. But going back, the author had bishop takes pawn, king takes, g4. Now, black played king to f7. See those 2 question marks? 1 question mark is a bad move. 2 question marks is a very bad move or a blunder, and it's a losing blunder. The plus minus means white has a 1 position after the king goes to f7. Black could have avoided checkmate had he played his king to the corner. See, then if the rook takes the pawn on d7 and the knight goes to e5, he doesn't get the winning check. See, when he went to f7, he gave white knight to e5 check, and then rook takes d7 pawn. By going to h8, he doesn't give white the check. So white opens up the g file for the rook. And he doesn't go to e5 now, he goes to g5. He's simply threatening knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn. And or, no, that's not his threat. His threat is knight to e6. See, the rook here pins the pawn on d7. So knight to e6 would fork the queen and rook, and that would win for white. Black plays knight to f6, knight to e6, queen to b6. We pick the rook up, and we move our king to a safe spot, and white has the better chances. White has 2, 4, 7 pawns. Black has 5, so white's 2 pawns ahead. But black has 2 knights, which is 6 points or 6 pawns, versus the rook, which is 5. So black gets a pawn there. He was 2 pawns down, but he gets a plus pawn for the 2 knights versus the rook. He's 1 pawn down. It's an advantage for white, but according to the computer, it may not be a winning advantage. It's a slight advantage in the ending. Okay, so that's a case where having the computer solve the problem nicely, and the author was a little misled by what happened in the game where white took the pawn, and stronger, which would have won immediately, was leaving the bishop there and just opening up the G file. Okay. This is a little twist. Everything we've looked at so far, white wins with an attack on the king knight 2 pawn, the g7 pawn for black. This time black wins. You can tell that black is the one attacking the white g2 pawn. He has a knight on h4 attacking the pawn on g2. Notice the nice placement of black's bishops. They're on d7, d6 by each other, and they come down and they attack white and black squares on the king side. Notice that the black rooks are side by side, and the rook on e8 attacks the bishop on e2. And notice that the black queen is on d5 in the middle of the board, attacking f3 and aiming to the g2 pawn. And then look at white's position. White's knight is on f3, defending. That's his most advanced piece. His next piece is the bishop on e2, merely defending the knight, threatening nothing. And white's queen is on his beginning square. White's black squared bishop is on the beginning square, and white's rook is in the corner. White totally misplayed the opening, and he's going to lose the game because of it. Guess who black is? He's a famous world champion who won the world championship in 1894 and held it for 27 years until 1921. Who was that German world champion? Who?
Steinitz?
No, that was the guy. This guy beat Steinitz. Did you ever hear of Emanuel Lasker? Anyway, Lasker was black, and he was a great world champion. He held it the record 27 years, and he was famous for his attacking and his endgame ability. Let's see what he does here. I don't remember exactly what black does. He sacks the knight for the g2 pawn. That's our theme, attacking the pawn. King takes. Now there's a pretty follow-up. Would anyone in the audience care to suggest a winning move for black? Lasker was not afraid to sacrifice multiple pieces.
Bishop takes.
The rook pawn?
H3, yeah.
Yep, that's the right move.
Sorry, we keep going.
Well, here. Oh, okay. So in the game, we took the bishop, right? Then the queen came up to f5. But if he goes here, now black moves his pawn up. He's going to attack the knight and the king with his kingside pawns. He's going to play g5 and then g4. Rook over, pawn up. He has nothing better than to give up the bishop to take the pawns. So he gives back the piece. Then he wouldn't take with the knight. That would open up to rook to f8 check. So he takes with the rook. He's attacking the queen. Queen moves back. Now the queen is threatening queen to e3 check. He moves the queen up to guard the e3 square. The bishop comes in attacking the rook, and he has the possible bishop to e3 check protected by the queen and rook. White tries to counterattack on the bishop. Black just takes the rook, knight takes. Now the queen comes over check, attacking the knight, so the knight has, I was thinking the knight had to go back. Bishop comes up, but that just does, oh, okay. Then if queen takes knight, rook takes bishop, so black pulls the bishop back. Now he's on the knight and the queen, so the knight takes the pawn. He's on the queen moves over, is on the knight. Now the rook comes over attacking the knight, and the knight, okay, that's pretty much it. The knight can't move because the answer would be, would probably be rook takes rook. And then the rook to g8 would threaten the queen down to g1 check, which would win. Okay. That was fairly complicated. That'll do it for tonight. Thanks for coming.